In today's video, I want to talk about Lynde Court Fire, which takes place at the climax of Chapter 2 in Angela Carter's comic novel Wise Children. Um, in terms of Lynde Court Fire, it has a climactic significance to Chapter 2. It's often regarded as the climax of the chapter. And if you can see from this list here of comedic aspects, there are lots of comedic aspects at play in what is a relatively short part of Chapter 2. The fire can also help students talk about the Carnivales theory, of which I've already made a video. And it also shows, because it's a fancy dress ball where the partygoers have come dressed as Shakespearean characters, shows how Carter is challenging Shakespeare's reputation and link with high art and high culture, with something which is much more ordinary and everyday. And of course, comedy is often about celebrating the universality of people in terms of our foibles, our flaws, our mistakes, but also focusing a lot of the time on common people, ordinary people, whereas tragedy tends to focus more on people with status and how they go about often losing such status. So it's a chaotic moment and regarded as the climax of the chapter. It has a very cinematic quality to it. So students will often imagine very easily, with all of the imagery and the description, that this could be something that you can imagine being filmed. It has that cinematic quality to it. So all I've done is I've taken four sections of this part of the chapter and just analysed it in terms of some specific sentences and words and linked it in the box on the right hand side to the comedy. So whenever you have madness and pandemonium, which is a word that comes from John Milton's Paradise Lost, you're going to get chaos and confusion. And that's often a great breeding ground for comedy, because when people are confused, mistakes and a sense of disequilibrium is going to be created. What's happening here in this extract is the fire is raging, and the partygoers and the fire brigade are crowded outside trying to put out the fire. But it's not just water that's being used to put out the fire, it's also the chorus boys are weeing on the fire. So that reminds us that comedy will often focus on lewd and crude behaviour, including bodily functions. Chorus boys often usually have quite serious, solemn roles whenever you see them, for example. Whereas the other partygoers are throwing champagne on the fire. And of course, champagne has connotations of something that's quite lavish and extravagant. You don't usually use champagne as an everyday drink. So the fact that champagne is being used here as water links to the carnivalesque in the sense that the hierarchy of things is being inverted, which means turned on its head. The fire brigade have also arrived, and in the arcs of water that they are spraying on these flames of this great house, rainbows are forming, which reminds us, as a almost like a narrative tool, Dora, and in brackets Carter, is always focusing on the surreal and beautiful images to suggest that even in moments of destruction, beauty is never too far away. So if you imagine that there's snow on the ground, which is quite bright and white, and you've then got rainbows forming in the orange glow of the fire. So the colours here are quite vibrant. It must actually look quite beautiful to look at. So we already have in this short passage links to comedy in this part of chapter 2. Moving on, we then get reference to some quite explicit sexual behaviour between some of the partygoers, and the party, despite the tragedy of this fire and the connotations of people being at risk of death and suffering, being burnt alive is not a laughing matter. Despite that, Dora quite flippantly says, "Nothing whets the appetite like a disaster," which means that despite all of this kind of tragedy or tragic potential, that the characters are actually using this kind of moment, this carefree and irreverence, to indulge in quite mischievous behaviour. And that goes to the heart of what the carnivalesque is. It's all about this kind of revelry in disorder. And comedy in itself, of course, will always focus a lot of the time on bodily functions and crudeness, including sex, which can also show that comedy can be about taboo. Sometimes comedies will use euphemisms in terms of describing sexual behaviour. and sometimes characters will be quite explicit, as is the case here. What's comic about this, though, is the fact that despite this sex being described in quite graphic detail, Carter has comically kept, or Dora has comically kept, the names of the Shakespearean characters who are indulging in this sexual behaviour. So Toby Bouch, I believe, comes from Twelfth Night. Cleopatra, Coriolanus, and Banquo's goes, of course, from Macbeth, are all well-known Shakespearean characters. So the fact that Carter is again merging and juxtaposing these characters which are associated with high culture and high art and elitism with kind of crude behaviour associated with common people or commoners means that Carter is challenging Shakespeare's role as somebody that just appeals to the elite and to those wanting high culture. So there's an added layer of farce and comedy here because Carter has kept um, the Shakespearean names. Moving on, this is when Melchior manages to drag his armchair out in order to watch the flames, and of course, he says things like, "Can't a man enjoy a glass of wine at his own fireside in yellow?" There, well, that's quite trivial. It's not necessarily a fireside like you would have in the front room of a house. This is his whole house burning to the ground, with hardly anything being able to be saved. So it's not a typical fireside. The fact that a waiter popped out of nowhere is again appealing to magic realism. There isn't an explanation as to where that waiter came from, so it appears like a magic trick. And of course, Prince in Exile, whenever you start to get language like that, you're starting to get references to Shakespeare. And it actually comes from Act 3 of Romeo and Juliet, when the prince banishes Romeo from Verona. So you're getting that kind of allusion through language to certain Shakespeare plays. And of course, Romeo and Juliet is regarded as a tragedy. So again, it's this merging of tragedy with quite chaotic and comedic aspects. The fact that he's drinking at all is not a usual response to seeing your own house burned to the ground. You know, whenever you see on the news these terrible accidents where a house has been effectively destroyed by a gas explosion and leaves a smoking crater in the ground, you don't usually see on the news the homeowners sitting outside drinking champagne, having a good time with it. So that's absurd and quite farcical in itself. And of course, at this point, Nora is missing, and she could have been killed, as is Peregrine. So again, drinking and drunkenness and that celebration is kind of at odds with the potential loss of a brother and daughter as well. Finally, a common symbol in Wise Children is the cardboard crown, and Melchior at this point seems to put more importance on that crown than the loss of his own daughter. Of course, to some extent, he has failed to acknowledge so far. The crown is made of cardboard. It's a priceless, valueless piece of stuff. It's obviously not a real crown. You know, you can imagine if it was a real crown worth millions of pounds with jewels and diamonds, that somebody might quite be upset with that. But it's not. It's cardboard with gold paint peeling off, and that is a metaphor for Melchior's flawed masculinity, but also his egotistical nature, and also this idea of obviously playing quite notable flawed characters such as Macbeth, which he does in Brighton earlier in this chapter. So it has perhaps sentimental value because it came from Melchior's father Ranulph, but it has no value in terms of monetary value. And it seems at odds and odd, really, for him to be mourning a crown and a piece of cardboard than a daughter, which obviously cannot be replaced. Finally, the last extract that I want to look at for the Lynde Court Fire for Chapter 2 is the ending, which proves to us that in a comedy, deaths and suffering are often prevented. Peregrine is fine, he's rescued Nora, and Nora is also safe and well in his arms, even though she's a bit perhaps covered in soot. So, despite all of the destruction, nobody dies, and that's typical of a comedy. And we've got that word a miracle, meaning it's almost miraculous that despite all of this destruction and fire, you actually have everyone alive and well and accounted for outside. The description of Perry here is often quite, is obviously heroic, but also quite surreal. And we have lots of narrative gaps, questions that we don't have answers for. For example, why didn't he burn? How did he know where Nora was? How did he know to rescue Melchior's crown? How did he escape the fire with all of that heat, etc.? So the fact that he kind of miraculously escapes this fire unharmed and even unsinged is quite miraculous, and again shows deaths and suffering are prevented. Again, we wonder whether or not this is Nora, whether this is Dora kind of embellishing the story, or if it happens slightly differently, which she doesn't want to tell us about. So we might question Dora's reliability. She is an unreliable narrator in this novel. So in the end, everyone is alive and well. And of course, the last thing that we get told about the Lynde Court fire, with all of the guests outside, is the fact that they're now going to go to Hollywood in chapter 3 to film A Midsummer Night's Dream, which ultimately ends up being a complete failure and waste of money. So even though Melchior's house and Lady Atalanta's house and Saskia and Imogen's house is now destroyed and everything in it, and they're effectively homeless, the focus is not on that tragedy, but on the next adventure, which is going to Hollywood in chapter 3. So, in summary, then, Lynde Court Fire is often an important section of chapter 2. Lots of students refer to chapter 2 in the Lynde Court Fire if the question fits, because there's lots of comedic aspects going on, there's lots of chaos, and it's also a good opportunity to talk about Carter's wonderful language and imagery that she creates, which is quite evocative, but also talk about things like the carnivalesque and magic realism. It has this wonderful cinematic quality to it because of all the vivid colours and sounds. So I definitely would urge students to look at the Lynde Court Fire episode with a degree of closeness, because it can be useful to use in an essay if, of course, the question fits. So hopefully that was useful, all about the significance of the Lynde Court Fire at the end of chapter 2 of Wise Children. Thank you very much for watching.